What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the macro developments coming out of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and a big part of my job is to follow those macro developments. So if that is something that you are interested in, and if you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, I hope you guys are doing well. Look, this is an end of week episode. It's supposed to be a bit longer, but unfortunately I'm a little bit tight time-wise, so I'm going to release what is probably going to be a shorter China update by the time it's finished. I'm not sure, we'll see how it goes at the end. And it's going to focus actually primarily on China US relations developments, because there's been a few major developments this week, and of course Biden was sworn in as the US president, and so there's been some key movements in the relationship that I want to cover. And at the beginning of the episode we're going to be talking about the outbreak situation in China and just having a little update since the last update a few days ago for those of you who are interested. So this is a very US-China heavy episode, and then into next week we'll have a regular China update episode. So I hope you guys enjoy it. As always, if you like the episode, it's a huge help if you smash the like button, hit the like button, and also big thank you to Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Okay guys, let's jump into this week's China update. So again, while the situation nationally is relatively stable, particularly in the south, for now at least, China is seeing daily increases in local infections and sporadic outbreaks. Millions are under lockdown, and new cities are now seeing new cases. A few days ago, I updated you guys about the outbreak situation. At that time, I said new locally transmitted cases were about 100 per day. It is now about 150 new cases per day. The new cases are being found in the northeast provinces of Jilin and Xinjiang, which border North Korea and Russia respectively, Hebei, which hugs the capital, as well as the capital Beijing itself. By Wednesday there had been some spread further south, but still mostly north of the Yellow River, with new cases in the coal mining province of Shanxi and the home province of Confucius, Shandong, being discovered. However, by Thursday, in a concerning development, 6 local infections were discovered in central Shanghai. On Friday, 3 more local infections were discovered in the megacity. The most sensitive city, Beijing, is seeing new local infections in the outer districts of Chunying and Daxing, both outer districts which house many of the millions of migrant workers that support the lifestyles of the middle class, the elites, and foreign expats that live in these central districts. On Tuesday, state media said that the government will track down and investigate anyone who entered Beijing from abroad after the 10th of December as part of their efforts to prevent a fresh COVID-19 outbreak from spreading in the capital. Sequencing of the 2 local cases that were discovered in Beijing on Sunday suggests that they belong to the more transmissible B.1.1.7 strain first identified in the UK. On Wednesday, China's National Health Commission announced that people traveling over the holiday period, which I believe begins on the 14th of February, will need to show a negative test issued up to 7 days before their departure. This potentially affects hundreds of millions of people. Before this announcement, the Ministry of Transport had estimated approximately 1.7 billion trips would be made during the Spring Festival this year. On Tuesday, before the handover to the Biden administration, the US State Department declared that the Chinese government is, quote, committing genocide and crimes against humanity through its repression of Uyghurs and other minorities in PRC regions of Xinjiang, end quote. We should say at this point that the US very rarely makes declarations like this, and this does trigger legal and diplomatic mechanisms within the US system. We will look at the US statements on this matter and then Beijing's official response. This is the statement from the US Secretary of State, quote, after careful examination of the available facts, I have determined that since at least March 2017, the People's Republic of China, under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party, has committed crimes against humanity against the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other members of ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. These crimes are ongoing and include the arbitrary imprisonment or other severe deprivation of physical liberty of more than 1 million citizens, forced sterilization, torture of a large number of those arbitrarily detained, forced labor, and the imposition of draconian restrictions on freedom of religion or belief, freedom of expression, and freedom of movement. And later in the statement, I have determined that the PRC, under the direction and control of the CCP, has committed genocide against the predominantly Muslim, Uyghurs, and other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. Of course, Biden is now the US president, not Trump. We need to ask, what is the Biden administration's view on this? Well, last year, a Biden spokesperson said that their position was that the situation in Xinjiang does constitute genocide. Do they still maintain this position? When asked about Pompeo's statement, Biden's upcoming Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, replied, quote, "That would be my judgment as well," end quote. Beijing has always denied any wrongdoing in Xinjiang, expressing that its activities in the region are strictly tied to anti-terrorism efforts and all faculties merely vocational training centers. When presented with potential evidence from journalists or scholars, the standard response is to assert that these are merely fabrications of dishonest US state-backed actors. Beijing's official government reaction of the US designation this week of genocide in Xinjiang is probably one of the strongest I've ever seen coming from the Foreign Ministry spokespeople. This is the quote. Quote, "Pompeo's venomous lies in the past several years are too numerous to be counted, and the matter you mentioned is only one of these ludicrous fabrications. To us, Pompeo's so-called determination is nothing more than a piece of waste paper. This notorious liar and cheater is making himself a doomed clown and a joke of the century with his show of lies and madness just before the curtain falls. Crimes against humanity and genocide are clearly defined in international law. China committing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang is a completely false allegation and a malicious farce fabricated and hyped up by certain anti-China, anti-communist forces, with Pompeo being a fanatical pioneer. Such a thing only exists in the ugly political conspiracies of Pompeo and his like. It has never happened, it is not happening, and it will never happen in China." End quote. This is the official English translation of Ms. Hua's statement. I've left the link to it in the description below. Literally a few minutes after Biden was sworn in as the US president, Beijing announced sanctions on former US officials, including former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Peter Navarro, Robert O'Brien, Matthew Pottinger, as well as John Bolton and Stephen Bannon. Quote, "Over the past few years, some anti-China politicians in the United States, out of their own selfish political interests and prejudice and hatred towards China, and showing no regard for the interests of the Chinese and American people, have planned, promoted, and executed a series of insane moves that have gravely interfered in China's internal affairs, undermined China's interests, offended the Chinese people, and seriously disrupted China-US relations. These individuals and their immediate family members are prohibited from entering the mainland, Hong Kong, and Macau of China. They and companies and institutions associated with them are also restricted from doing business with China." End quote. I doubt that many of these ex-officials have any plans to visit the mainland anytime soon. Some commentators have pointed out rather, that unlike US sanctions against PRC officials, these PRC sanctions against American officials include immediate family members, which may justify further US sanctions extending scope to include family members too. The timing of the announcement may be seen by some as provocative, right in the middle of Biden's opening speech, and the timing was no coincidence since it was made at about 1 a.m. Beijing time rather than during regular business hours. The sanctions actually go farther than one might think. Let's look at the last line again. It's quote, "Companies and institutions associated with them are also restricted from doing business with China." The key word here is associated. What exactly does this mean? Well, one state media account gave examples of possible applications. In that article, one possible example included was if, say, Pompeo's wife gave a paid speech at a conference affiliated with Koch Industries in some way, then no part of Koch Industries could ever do business with China. This would be a very stretched application if it was the case. If a media company owned by Disney, for example, gave a paid interview to an ex-official, would Disney be banned from doing business in China? Would they be sanctioned as well? That question is still up in the air. While the sanctions are very strong and do send a strong message, they also risk backfiring in many different ways, and their timing and form certainly do not leave good impressions on the new US-China policy team in Washington replacing these officials. Biden's national security spokeswoman Emily Horn said in a statement, quote, "Americans of both parties should criticize this unproductive and cynical move. President Biden looks forward to working with leaders in both parties to position America to outcompete China," end quote. And since this is a heavy US-China episode, let's look at a few more general developments over the last few days. I think it's worth looking at what Biden's Secretary of State pick said regarding China's Trump policy over the last few years during his Senate confirmation hearing. Quote, "I also believe that President Trump was right in taking a tougher approach to China. I disagree very much with the way that he went about it in a number of areas, but the basic principle was the right one. And I think it's actually helpful to our foreign policy," end quote. It certainly seems that the US State Department will maintain a degree of its tougher approach to the PRC as it transitions over to a Biden administrative-led structure. The sense I also get reading PRC commentators too is that they do not view Biden's team as having any China dubs in it. In the last episode, we spoke about the sense of triumphalism that is increasingly prominent in Beijing among elite discourse. The idea that the superiority of the Chinese system, evidenced by the PRC overtaking a declining US-led West, is very much a mainstream view here. This week, there's been a number of articles and major publications reinforcing this narrative. For example, a few days ago, the Beijing News interviewed the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations head Yuan Peng, who we have quoted before. In the article entitled, quote, "The United States is sick, China has stabilized, and the world has changed," end quote, Yuan expressed, quote, "The trend of the rising East and the declining West, 东升西降, is irreversible," end quote. This is very similar to what Chen Yixin said, which we discussed in the previous episode from a few days ago. Another example from this week, Tsinghua director Zhou Bo published a popular piece entitled, "Will America Decline Peacefully," end quote. So we can see that this narrative is very much in the mainstream here. As I've said before, I do not believe that the evidence in which this particular narrative is built is sufficiently robust, and it is more a product of the current political and media environment in Beijing. Furthermore, I believe that this narrative, if unchallenged among PRC policy makers and elite, can lead to miscalculations and serious policy mistakes. One more thing, while we're on US-China, the Phase 1 trade deal. Can you guys remember that? Do you guys remember that? It seems like a lifetime ago. Well, Bloomberg reports that by the end of December of last year, China had purchased about 58.1% of the $172 billion US worth of goods it pledged to buy last year under the so-called Phase 1 agreement with Washington. Based on their calculations, Bloomberg's calculations, it brought China 60.4% of targeted manufactured products, 64.4% of agricultural goods, and just 39% of the target for energy imports. Okay guys, thank you for watching. That's this week's in-a-week episode or special US-China episode of China Update. Hope you guys found it informative and useful for your own needs. Wherever you are, stay safe and stay sane. I will see you guys next time on China Update.